that wanted to participate in the panel could introduce themselves and just describe their name, pronouns, and hi, this is our beautiful panel. Thank you all. I appreciate you, Brian and Gordon, for doing tech. Yeah, if you just describe your experience at UF briefly, what degree you got and when you attended, that'd be great. Ronnie, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd love to. I'm Ronnie Sanlow. This is so exciting. I love seeing all these great faces. I graduated from Florida in 1969 with a music degree. And Florida then was, you know, in 1965, when I started at Florida, two things were happening. One was Playboy had announced their top 10 party schools in the country. And they didn't put Florida on the list because they didn't want to mix the professionals with the amateurs. And when my father read that, I almost couldn't go to Florida. So, and it was a great party school, bar none. The other thing was I got there in 1965, just off of the heels of the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee that had just completed an 8-year lesbian and gay witch hunt on our campus, as well as South Florida and Florida State. And so people were deathly afraid that if they were lesbian or gay, that we weren't using any other words, and we weren't even using the word lesbian. If you were gay, you would be kicked out of school and that would be the end of you. And so there was this tremendous sense of fear that actually kept me in the closet for the next 15 years. But the campus was awesome during that time. There were protests about everything. There was lots of activities, civil rights protests, ROTC protests, Vietnam protests. Everyone was trying to break down Tigard Hall door, which was great fun. So it was a very exciting place to be in the 60s.
Thank you so much. Oren.
Yeah, so I go by Kim actually. And I graduated from the University of Florida in 1984 with a business degree. I think by that time we had made it into the top 10 party schools in the country and made the list. I know I definitely did my part to contribute to that while I was in school. You know, it's interesting. I think that you did not, in the 80s, you did not necessarily have the level of social awareness. Certainly we had, I think, a LGBTQ organization for students at the school at the time. I transferred in as a junior. I ended up joining a fraternity. My fraternity experience was part of my coming out process because it separated me from the life I'd had in the Panhandle, born again Southern Baptist. But in other ways, it also sort of continued the closet for me. I did come out while I was in college. I enjoyed working for Disney one summer, and that just, I met other gay people. And I ended up coming out. I had to move back into my fraternity house in the fall and basically go back into the closet during that period of time. But it was definitely part of the process for me.
I'm also a fraternity graduate, so that's very interesting, Kim. I would love to ask you more about like that process for you. But I
have an interesting Fort Lauderdale spring break story.
I bet you do.
So
Maria, sorry.
That's all right. Thanks, Harrison. My name is Maria Carter. I graduated in 2004 with a bachelor's degree in journalism and a minor in women's studies. And everyone's kind of mentioned what life was like. So I'll just briefly say that I felt like I would never have realized I was gay, probably, if I hadn't gone to UF. I mean, I came from a very, very small town, rural town in North Florida. And it hadn't even occurred to me this was an option at all. And then I wound up in women's studies classes, and we know how that ends. So yeah, I felt it was complicated because in the early 2000s, you know, certainly things were better than they were in Dr. Samlow's time in terms of being able to come out and feeling safe on campus, but it still felt very underground, like gay culture was very much underground, and like you didn't really, the only time I ever really interacted with other gay people and we were open with each other was at the Pride Student Union. It was not like you were in class and there was just casual, people were casually outing themselves or holding hands or anything like that. I didn't see anything like that on campus. And it didn't feel like, it still very much felt like a, you know, a subculture, not like something that was integrated at all in the main culture. But so UF was both very exciting for me and a little scary.
That's so interesting, like learning you are gay by like getting exposed to more people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have questions about that as well, but thank you so much. Franz.
Hey, my name is Franz. I went to UF from 2003 to 2007. And for me, I'd like to say I was in the closet, but I'm pretty sure everyone else knew, even though I was making an effort to have it not be known. So the only person it was really a secret to was to myself, I guess, if you can put it that way. I was involved in student government. I was also really involved in the local church that I was going to at the time. And because of that, it was very much, I was kind of afraid to come to terms with everything then with the religious background that I had growing up at the time. And so I didn't really officially come out of the closet until maybe 6 years later after graduating. But being there and being around people who were also active in government and also in my residence halls where I was, residence life was really helping me to come to terms with having those conversations of opening my mindset and preparing me for that process. So I would love to talk about that more on how those key people get put in your life and we kind of attract each other almost. Like you get put with people who everyone that was my closest friends, we were all saying we weren't gay at the time. And now we all are either gay, trans, or in other sections. And so we've kind of joked over the years of how we started out in this cluster and how we've navigated it after that. Oh, I forgot to say what I graduated in. So I graduated with the bachelor's in classics, Latin and Greek translation, and a minor in chemistry.
That is a very interesting mix of degrees as well. Quite versatile in thinking. Kevin.
Hey everyone, my name is Kevin Rivera Alvarez. I graduated in 2020. I'm currently checking in from Mexico. Again, the Wi-Fi is a little, hit or miss. So if at any point you have to interrupt me and say you can't hear me, I'm not going to be offended. Please do so that you don't hear a bunch of static noise. Going into a little bit about the current generation or the past decade, I guess, it's definitely a big role to sum up a whole generation, a whole 10 years with one person and one experience. So I want to speak lightly on my own experience, but I did go to college already having come out. So I came out in high school, and coming out in high school at the time, I thought it was so scary for me to do that at the time, but it actually propelled me into the inner social circle. The cheerleaders admired me. Even the football players had some level of respect because I was best friends with all of their girlfriends. And so that kind of propelled me to even be student body president and prom king. And when I arrived at the University of Florida, I thought that would be like a badge, like I would be the unique, oh wow, you did so much. And it was so funny to me because when I arrived on campus, everyone was seemingly out. Everyone was proud. Everyone was also involved in student government. And I met so many other LGBTQ plus students who had also been on prom corps and been so admired and revered at their own high schools. So it was kind of like a time for celebration. And what's really interesting about my identity is that I was so proud of being gay, but I actually came into college so ashamed of being Hispanic or Latino. And isn't that just like a funny thing to say? I actually came into college wanting to switch up my last name, maybe like Kevin Smith. You know, I was toying with the idea because I was just so ashamed of having to prove that I was Puerto Rican every time I had a conversation with someone. And it wasn't until all of the various groups in the University of Florida and how proud they were of all Latinx culture that I really integrated myself as Kevin Rivera, that identity. But I guess the reason I share that story is because my biggest fear wasn't telling people I was gay. It was actually telling people one of my other identities, that I was Hispanic. So it's kind of a funny story how we've come here.
Yeah, that is fascinating how the acceptable identities have changed so much in the last like 100 years of
Yeah.
now we can kind of like
Definitely.
share gay first and like these other things that like we have stigma
Yeah.
towards ourselves, if anything.
And
Thank you for
definitely, I know there's, yeah, sorry. I was just gonna say, Harrison, there's
go.
many people in this generation that still have a little bit of trouble coming out or a little bit of fear. Um, but as a whole, many people are stepping out of the closet a lot earlier and a lot younger. So the times are really changing.
Yeah. In some ways, I really think that because I came out at 12, which is like, I don't know anyone else that kind of came out of closet like that early. But so I've seen like a lot of people in my life come out as gay and like be very prideful, but there's a ton of people as well that are just like very comfortable in like heterosexual relationships as well. So I think there's like a lot more LGBT people than maybe is like fully, I don't know, like counted in the population perhaps. But those identity intersections really interest me, that half the panelists or so really identified with Christianity, and that was like a primary identity that y'all presented to the world. I was just wondering if anyone kind of had a comment on, did those other identities that you were familiar with necessarily help your experience, or like how did they intersect, if at all, with being gay or queer? Did you kind of like present these other badges of yourselves like face forward?
Well, for me, this is Ronnie. I really had no interest in identifying as anything. I spent my junior high and high school years being the best student, the best musician, the best this, the best that, so that people wouldn't see me as the little lesbian who was like totally closeted. Very clear to myself who and what I was, but not public about it at all, or nobody knew. And by the time I got to college, it never occurred to me that I could come out at the University of Florida. And I never really gave it a whole lot of thought. I just did what I always knew to do, and that was to be the best of everything so that you couldn't see me. And as I've talked to other people who were at Florida during the same time I was, that was pretty much how everybody was. We did not want to be known. The only identity that I had besides female at Florida was the fact that I was Jewish. And my 1965 was really the first year that many Jewish students from the Miami area, which I am, went to Florida. And so we all pretty much just stayed to ourselves. Because there still was a lot of anti-Semitic feelings on campus. And so I really just didn't get involved with anything where I could be identified, certainly where I could be identified as a gay person.
That is somewhat shocking to hear about anti-Semitism on campus. That's something that like has really never been discussed, I think, at least in my friend groups. But apologizing for other Floridians as a Florida born. I am sorry that if anyone ever made you feel uncomfortable. That is something that we should be ashamed of.
Right.
So this is Kim. You know, I would say just a couple of observations. Growing up Southern Baptist in Maria, a small North Florida town, that was very much a part of my identity and who I was. And in high school, I was, you know, my brother was a great jock in high school. I was no good at sports. I do know, you know, when I was a sophomore, we were asked by the cheerleaders, a couple of guys, to be cheerleaders. And no one in my school would do it. And I was like, I'm not going to do it. It's only been a couple of years since my classmates called me a sissy, and there's no way I'm going to be a cheerleader. I would secretly have loved to be a cheerleader. But because everybody told me, no, don't be a cheerleader, don't be a cheerleader, that's what I did. I became a cheerleader. And that was, you know, that was part of my identity. It wasn't necessarily, Ronnie, about being the best. Although I did excel at academics at my school, it was about finding, I guess, what was the sort of right road for me. And the right road for me was being a born again Christian for so long. But, you know, I went to like church camps and music camps, and I experienced this camaraderie and group cohesiveness. And so I went to University of Florida, and I immediately started going to the Baptist campus ministry, and that sort of became my identity. But I met a guy there who was rushing a fraternity, and we decided to rush fraternities, and that led me on a different path. And for me, it was very much a divergence from my Christian upbringing, the whole social fraternity atmosphere, just very much breaking away from that. And like I said, that was kind of the first step for me. You know, Ronnie, I think it's interesting. I think by the time that I got to University of Florida, there was very little, at least as far as I was aware of, anti-Semitic sentiment in the school. Certainly the Jewish community was pretty significant at University of Florida at that point. And I don't recall there ever being even, and my fraternity was KA, which, you know, like old Southern fraternity. And I don't recall there ever being any sort of expression of anti-Semitic. There certainly were more comments that were anti-gay than anti-Semitic, or even racist to a certain extent.
Well, wasn't KA the fraternity that I think right around the time you were there that hung that big banner over their balcony during a homecoming parade saying something like "faggots stay home" or U flags? It'd say UFLAGS.
That was the
But then
name.
it crossed out
That
the
was,
L.
yeah, that was the name. Now that I think of it, that was the name of the LGBTQ student group, UFLAG, I think at the time. And it very well could have been, it wasn't while I was there, I can definitely tell you that. It probably was after I left, but I would not be surprised.
Yeah, I've seen photos of it. It's interesting history.
Well, I can go next if that's all right. So I think I definitely identified a lot with what you were saying as well, Ronnie. I definitely wore a couple of different labels, and being a super achiever was one of them. Definitely growing up from African-American background. And I actually had a lot of trauma being a Black male and trying to hide my sexuality the whole time period. So it actually was very healing for me being in going up to the Rights Union, to the student government floor, and we had some people who were in BSU, Black Student Union, who were around, who actually kind of gave me a modeling of they're okay with, you know, the idea of people being of queer culture around them. Even though people were not necessarily out, there were multiple of us in the room and we could feel the energy of each other. And there was a level of support that was there. So I would say that that was very helpful, especially with the church that I was going to at the time. It was very much like I was expected to have a date with a woman every week. And it was literally because we had to have the girls go on dates with those that we would prevent them from struggling with lust. I mean, it was to that degree of what people today would say, this is Netflix documentary style cuckoo over the moon kind of things. And but being around so many different people, it challenged my thinking, a lot of different processes, and helped me to question and say, is this really what I want? And it helped start my journey from that time moving forward. I also would say I definitely started getting involved as an ally in the Gay Straight Student Alliance. And so I would go to groups again as just an ally, but that also was very beneficial for me. But other than that, I was super overachiever. I was the guy who was doing the double major. I had a bakery that I was renting space from the bakery spot over in Garing's bookstore behind the stadium, and doing that when I finished classes, and doing all the baking, delivering goods over to Coffee Culture on the mornings at like 6 o'clock in the morning. And I was a chemistry TA. And then I was also a graduate hall director my senior year and on legislative team. So it was like my name was going to be associated with all of these things that I thought would bring acceptance to me rather than my sexuality. So it was a big diversion for me at that time, wearing these different labels.
Mhm.
Thank you, Franz. There were a couple questions in the chat, so I'm just going to say them aloud for the video. Someone was wondering, Kim and Maria, what towns are you from? And Kim said Ponce de Leon, and Maria said Wauwakula County. Did I butcher that? Okay, I'm gonna act like I said it right. So I'm sorry if not.
Yeah, Harrison, it's Wakala, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Kevin, do you have a response?
A response to it.
Other than Latinx, did you have any identities when in college that propelled you through your college experience? Or at all, how Dr. Sandlow was saying how she experienced anti-Semitism. Kim mentioned in his fraternity experience that he identified some racist comments. Did you experience kind of like any of those experiences, or have identities that like led you through?
You know, I have had my fair share of like, you know, anti-homosexual catcalling, like yelling if I'm holding my boyfriend's hand. But that actually doesn't faze me. The identity that I think is most difficult to integrate for me nowadays, and kind of my next frontier of integration, is the religious aspect of my identity. So a Protestant Christian, I actually, and I'm continuing this conversation from the religious questions that we've had thus far. It is so, I'm so hesitant to share a little bit of my religious ideologies, even with a fellow Christian, because if I see a fellow Christian and I ignore them, I can go about my day fine. But the second I share their love for Jesus and their passion for studying the Bible, I know that I'm letting them in. I'm letting them into my space, into my heart, into my mind. And in the back of my headspace is just, Kevin, just wait for it. They're gonna ask if you're ready to convert through the love of Jesus Christ. And I try to push that away, try to push it away. But strangers, friends, and family alike always bring it up. And it's frustrating because every Christian to me is going to be having that question. So I start to see that identity in that whole scope of people as one question. Kevin, are you ready to convert to heterosexuality, to the love of Jesus Christ. And I encounter it so frequently that it kind of pushes me away from that identity. One story to close is that I, as a teacher, my teaching assistant this year, she was an integral part of my classroom, and she was a very joyous Christian woman. And she kind of was so eloquent with her words and with her praise and with her worship that she would share Bible verses with me, and we would have conversations and talk about lunch. And she even invited me and my boyfriend to her home to share a meal. So imagine 8 months go by and she's never asked me that. She's never popped the question. And I think to myself, okay, Kevin, like this is the moment of transformation. Like you have integrated this and you are now maybe in a place of healing, in a place of acceptance, and you can move forward in that religious identity. And about 1 week before the end of the school year, she approached that conversation with me. And for like a whole week period, I entered like a state of like sadness and hurt and even frustration, because someone who had gotten so close to me and who I thought I was in the clear still posed the same question, even after having met my significant other and having dinner. So that's kind of my experience. And I hope that illustrates that even as I'm continuing to integrate my intersectionalities, my religious intersectionality of being a Christian is very complicated and complex to integrate.
Evan, I really identify with you. I wrestle with those same things as well, of really engaging actively in the Christian community, but having those really helpful people that are loving towards you and just saying like they're trying to help from their perspective to try to like make you straight, because in their eyes that's like the ideal form of living. And the only advice that I can kind of give is, as soon as I just kind of like laugh it off now, like duck off water off a duck's back. I've just been like, oh, that's very sweet of you. Thank you for like trying to like improve my life. But like at the end of the day, we're the only people that like know how we feel inside, and like being gay is not something that I can control. So like I kind of just like laugh it off and be like, okay, like those two identities can coexist. And like, even if someone doesn't necessarily understand that those two things can exist, that's not my problem if they don't understand that. And like, they can be okay. And like, I can be okay doing my thing as well. If that helps. This Christian will not ask you to be straight.
Period.
So Brian has nicely pointed out to me that one of our panelists couldn't actually be here today, and another panelist was willing to kind of discuss some of their experiences with us.
Right.
So, Doctor.
So that would be me. Thank you. Art Copleston was at Florida from 1956 to 1960. He was an engineering major, and he had been in the Marines for 4 years before he came to Florida. So he was a non-traditional aged undergrad. And during that time, the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee began their lesbian and gay witch hunts at Florida and other universities, but mostly at Florida. Began their witch hunts in 1956 and ended in 1964. During that time, over 800 students were kicked out of school. Hundreds of professors were fired. A number of them died by suicide. It was a horrible, horrible time at Florida. The campus cops were doing investigations. I'm actually I've written a number of things about that. It's called the Johns Committee, from a guy named Charlie Johns from Stark headed the committee. He was acting governor for a period of time. And so they went after the NAACP because the McCarthy hearings in Washington said that Black people were communists. And so Florida created this committee, funded it, and they went after the NAACP, who basically said, get out of our faces were protected by law, which was true. So they went after homosexuals on campuses. Like I said, many people, over 800 students left campus. What happened with the women, which was terrible, is women were interrogated, and if they were found to be lesbian, and actually they didn't interrogate anybody who they didn't suspect, women were assigned a roommate by the dean of women's office. They were assigned a roommate who would watch them and make them keep a diary. They had to go out with men. They had to date men. They had to go to the campus shrink. They had to keep a diary. And if they didn't do that, then the university sent articles. They had these pre-made articles to people's hometown newspapers saying that this person, this student was a gay student, male or female. So it was a terrible time. And Art was one of the students caught up in that. His boyfriend was one of the music professors who, after they were both accused of being gay men, the professor hung himself, as did a number of professors. And Art made it through. He graduated, but he remained in the closet for his whole life. He didn't trust other gay people. He did have a male partner for a period of time who died of AIDS. Art is still alive. He's 90 years old. He's a good friend of mine, lives in Palm Springs. And he showed me the yearbook, the 1959 yearbook, and it's the only mention of everything that happened during the witch hunt time. And basically it says that the yearbook is dedicated to the people who, for unknown reasons, had to leave school and may their lives somehow find peace. So that was, it gives me goosebumps now, even just to think about it. So the witch hunts were over in 1964. The funding was discontinued. The committee published a book called Homosexuality in Florida, which was given to the Florida legislature to describe what a homosexual in Florida was like. And they had all these pictures of nude little boys in this thing. I mean, they all should have been arrested. But this book became the hottest market on the porn market in 1964. And many people, like I said, were kicked out of school. I got to Florida in 1965, and I heard about a number of women I was in Rawlings Hall, a number of women who had been kicked out of Rawlings the year before. And so and I'm sure so many others, just stayed closeted for our entire stay at Florida, and really even beyond. I did meet a guy at Florida. I married him a couple years after we graduated. I actually thought he was gay, which was one of the reasons why I married him. I still think he's gay even today, 60 years later, but he's really closeted. But we have 2 children. And ironically, my daughter is straight, but her 2 children are pansexual and bisexual, and my son is pansexual, and he's got a transgender child and a straight child. So, life goes on. But Art was this book, Demons and Deliverance, tells his story, and it's quite touching. So this was just to give you a taste of what it might have been like back in the 50s, as those of us are coming on board in the 60s during the time of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, where all of our attentions went elsewhere for that particular decade. So thanks for asking. Thanks for including this, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And thank you so much, Ronnie, for